Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is CPDP's opening night. It's traditionally a more relaxed enterprise because people are coming to Brussels, are flying in, are finding their hotels, and are worried about checking in and being there tomorrow on time at 8 a.m. we start, like every year. So you will all be there tomorrow morning at 8. But so the opening night is also where the format is not controlled by CPDP, and where we allow panels to go to find their own tempo and and to present ideas in a different way. And so this evening is organized by the Brussels Privacy Hub, NIM Technologies, Privacy Salon, and Brave. And CPDP is not amongst the organizers, but we welcome the co-organizers. We're very happy with them having found a way to us, and we hope for more collaborations in the future. It is a packed opening night. We have 2 hours, and we have 2 sessions, one on cloud money and one on vulnerability. There are 2 moderators that each moderator will present her or his own panel. Just about this opening night, what I can say from CPDP, well-chosen themes. I like the idea of money. It's when will privacy reach the common person? Like the common person is not us, because we're fascinated by privacy. But I think the money theme is maybe a candidate. People understand what happens with their money. We don't understand what happens with our privacy, but we do understand what happens with our money. So I like that theme a lot, and I hope for some bridging between those that are totally in favor of digital currencies and those that are totally against digital money and want to work and keep on working with traditional coins. I hope both can one day find each other, because I think they have the same concerns. Democracy is one of them. Privacy is, of course, another one. So it's a golden privacy theme for me, and it should have been at CPDP, and I'm happy it is there now. And then we go to a new theme. It's not new. Vulnerability is not new. It's as old as mankind, as humankind. But it's important to bring it at a privacy conference, because the whole GDPR and the whole privacy reasoning is based on the reasonable, educated, older person, often a man. But now, what about the rest of mankind and humankind? And so I'm very happy with both themes. And by having said that, I want to give the floor to Jaya, who's going to introduce her panel. Thank you, Jaya, for doing that and being here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction. That was a wonderful introduction. Yes, thank you. And thanks to the audience that has shown up on this beautiful sunny day. So yeah, we proposed this panel about 6 months ago, when there was a lot of discussion of the digital euro, kind of in anticipation that this would potentially be a major theme of the CPDP this year. It isn't quite that theme, and I think we have a little bit of a history at NIM of proposing themes that are kind of maybe a bit early or too late, but it's not quite clear. Last year, NIM Technologies also did an opening panel which was focused on client-side scanning. And what we've seen over the past year is, in fact, client-side scanning has become quite an issue with the online security bill in the UK and also bills in Europe. So I'm hoping that something similar might happen with the topic of CBDCs, digital money. And I think we have the right people up here on the panel today to really dig into what's at stake. So the title of the panel is Cloud Money, Data Privacy and Sovereignty, and what is at stake in this big shift. So what we're seeing, and I think a lot of people in the audience will know this, and as Paul mentioned, money is something that everybody touches on a daily basis, but what we touch is changing form, right? It's changing mediums from something that is physical cash into digital forms, and taking a variety of digital forms. And when something changes forms, quite fundamental things actually start to shift. The people that provide for those particular forms shift, but also the medium themselves start to have externalities, right? And when we're talking about the digital world, those externalities usually come in the form of data, right? And that usually comes with a variety of issues, including definitely privacy. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And on the panel with me, I've got Brett Scott, who's the author of Cloud Money, the book. And I stole that title, which is a fantastic title. But the full title of Brett's book is Cloud Money, Cash, Cards, and Crypto, right? The War for Our Wallets. So great title. And then we've also got Andrés Arauz, who was the previous director of the Central Bank of Ecuador, has done a lot of research into the data of money. So he's going to be talking a little bit about that, but was actually also probably one of the first people in the world to run experiments with what we now call central bank digital currencies. So we're going to get into that a little bit as well. And with me, we also have Alfredo Real, who's part of the research team at NIM Technologies. And is replacing Anya Piotrowska, who heads the research team. Alfredo has very kindly stepped in. Co-author of a paper on eCash. So how can we really merge the best of both worlds instead of getting the worst of digital money? So Alfredo is going to be talking a little bit about the possibilities, the technical possibilities around eCash and a technical analysis of the digital euro. I myself, I'm Jaya Clara Brecki, and I'm head of strategy at NIM Technologies. And NIM is a privacy startup. We're based out of Switzerland. And we are building, amongst other things, something called a mixnet, but also working on quite sophisticated cryptographic technologies around anonymous credentials, a lot of the cryptography of which Alfredo is responsible for, and a lot of which is also the core building blocks of the possibility of having eCash, basically, privacy-preserving anonymous payments, even though it's in digital form. So fantastic panel. And I think I'll start with Brett, actually, because Brett usually gives a fantastic overview of what's really at stake when we're talking about this transition from the physical form of cash to the new digital forms that we're seeing in kind of card payments and CBDCs and so on. So, Brett, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure.
Big picture.
I'll do my best. It's interesting that right now, when people are in a lot of the current debates about so-called cashless society, everyone's focusing on CBDC, the sort of new hypothetical state-issued digital currency. But historically, the debate around cashless society is very different. Historically, cashless society is actually a euphemism used to refer to the situation where private sector banks take over the monetary system, all right? Because in our current systems, private sector banks control the digital systems. And immediately you can tell there's quite a different politics to that when you say to people, a cashless society sounds like, you're sort of getting rid of something, or you talk about the absence of something. But when you ask what's present in a cashless society, well, it's big tech and big finance, really. And that immediately gives you a different sense of the politics of what's at stake. And also, when you really zoom out and you look at big meta processes and capitalist economies, and you ask yourself, why is this actually happening? Well, for hundreds of years, big companies have tried to automate things, right? And right now, when you're looking at the monetary system, it's one of the new waves of automation, right? So the cash system essentially stands in the way of corporate automation. A lot of these players, for example, Uber and Amazon, etc., they hate cash, de facto. They can't automate it, all right? So at a structural level, the global economy has these tensions in it where non-automated, non-digital things are getting slowly shafted out precisely because they stand in the way of scaling and making things faster and, more automated. And that's what's really going on. But many ordinary people actually don't resonate with that vision. Many ordinary people do actually want to keep physical cash. But in many mainstream circles, this is just not appreciated, or people don't feel they can act upon it. One of the most frustrating elements of the debate around cashless society is that digital money is presented as some kind of upgrade to cash, right? So it's a little bit like people think of cash as being like the horse cart of payments. And then they say, well, I guess digital money is like the car, and it's going to be this natural transition where we move from one to the other. But this is an incredibly dubious vision for multiple reasons. And one of the best metaphors to kind of help you break out of that way of thinking about cash is to realize that the global or any monetary system is made up of multiple different players and who issue multiple different types of money in multiple different forms. And the metaphor to use to grasp this is to think about casinos. All right, I don't know how many of you guys go to casinos, but if you go to a casino and you take 100 euros and you hand it over to a casino, that casino issues you chips. All right, those chips are a secondary form of money, privately issued, that can be used within the confines of the casino. And the only reason those chips have power is that you believe they can be redeemed back for the primary form of money. All right? Now, actually, our whole monetary system works like this with multiple layers of money. If you go to a bank and you hand it over cash, you'd be handing over a primary form of money, and what you get back issued out to you is a secondary, privately issued form of money. And you might want to think about that as being like a digital casino chip. All right? And what's referred to as a cashless society is really a situation where you become totally dependent upon these second layer digital casino chips issued out by private banks. All right. There's also a third layer built on top of that about the likes of PayPal and so on. And so this is where you start to see the politics of our current monetary system when you think about these different layers that are going on. And one of the big debates that's going on, one of the reasons why we're having this debate around central bank digital currency, or one of the big reasons, is that there's a massive financial stability problem when you undermine the first layer, all right? And in our current society, the first layer is the cash system. It's the only form of state-issued money we can hold. But public confidence in those second-tier systems, those digital chips, as it were, is predicated upon the public believing they can get access to cash. But if access to cash is being undermined, suddenly those digital chips start to seem a lot less secure, which is precisely why there's a debate right now about the so-called digital euro, because during the pandemic, there was a massive drop in cash usage. The last thing I'll say, though, is that the drop in cash usage often is presented as being the sort of organic kind of process that the public has just sort of naturally moved towards. But a lot of what my book is doing, my work, is looking at all the top-down processes whereby large players have actively undermined the cash system for many, many decades. All right? So there's a lot of top-down pushes against the cash system, which eventually manifests in our society as a reduced access to cash and a slow cultural shift to these digital systems. I can maybe tail it off there, or maybe can I do one last little thing? I'm going to quickly just to finish off to maybe illustrate what's at stake from a sort of the ordinary person's perspective. Is I talked about that digital casino chip metaphor. That's one useful thing to think about. But it's often useful to think about cash as being like the public bicycle system of payments, all right? And the digital systems being like the private Uber of payments, right? And it may be that those sort of Uber-fied payments have a certain convenience to them, but the real politics is to imagine, in our transport metaphor, imagine if companies like Uber controlled the entire transport system. All right? Imagine if there was no balance of power between companies like Uber and the public bicycle system. All right? And that's where you start to see the politics. You'd see mass surveillance, you'd see huge censorship problems, you see massive resilience problems in the system, massive exclusion problems, and huge centralization of power, essentially. So the debate around cash and protecting cash is really about protecting a balance of power in the monetary system, not only between different issues, but between different forms of money. And I'll close it off there.
Great, thanks very much, Brett. So fundamentally, a radical shift in power from public infrastructure, in a sense, so money as a public infrastructure, towards a very hyper-privatized form of infrastructure at the core of society that, in fact, has a lot of risks attached to it, inequality being one of them, but also, like you said, censorship and potential privacy issues, which is interesting because normally people think about, when we're talking about CBDCs, that's where people start freaking out about the privacy issues. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But to get a little bit into the question of data specifically, I would love to hear from Andres to give a little bit of the overview of what is the data of money really, and what changes about the data of money when you move from cash to digital payments and CBDCs.
Well, thank you, Jai, for the invitation. It's good to be here. So when you move to electronic transactions, so non-cash transactions with the private banking system, that information which corresponds to the transaction has to flow through several actors, right? So from the terminal, from the point of sale, you know, to the payment providers, the telecommunication provider, and of course, where the transaction is eventually settled, so where the accounting happens, is in the balance sheet of, you know, predominantly a bank somewhere. Now, if that transaction involved at least a different bank, you know, so if you have your money in your bank and I have it in a different bank, we're going to need a third bank to settle the transaction between your account and my account. So we now have three banks involved. So that means three institutions now have access to that information. But then every step of the way too, you know, you have these intermediaries, these payment processors that also get a copy of the transaction. And eventually most of that is stored in the cloud, which is of course non-existent, but the actual cloud is a series of data centers that are strategically placed around the world, but overwhelmingly concentrated in the global north, right? So part of my research analyzes where the credit card companies' data centers are and how they get to keep a copy of a regular, you know, debit card transaction of someone in Peru, making a local payment, you know, buying, you know, some milk in the street shop. But, you know, the Visa or MasterCard data centers get a copy of that. And then, because of this geographic distribution of power, because of the concentration of data, that's an issue that's well known in this space, you get sovereignty considerations as well. Because, for example, because those data centers are in the United States, because of the USA Patriot Act, the US government has access of that data. You know, they can subpoena, they can make requests, and they can have access to transactions about foreign citizens in foreign countries, about foreign goods and services, but that were paid with payment processors that have the data centers in the United States. This, for example, happened in a famous case in Canada already almost 20 years ago, when in Canada it was already legal to purchase marijuana, but it wasn't in the United States. So there was a big controversy as to information that the US government had about Canadian citizens that were purchasing marijuana, but being processed through the payment processors that have their data stored in the United States. So this, of course, has even broader implications, because not only can the requests of information be made sort of in the conventional sense of a subpoena or a court order or stuff like that, but we have the intelligence agencies that have basically, you know, backdoors or unauthorized access via hacking methods and so on, of the data, not just of their own country, of their own citizens, but basically of the entire planet, whoever uses a card or makes a digital payment. Now, countries have slowly caught up to this, especially in the global south, larger countries of the global south, and have started issuing data localization laws, specifically oriented to domestic payments. And of course, domestic payments are several orders of magnitude, you know, 10,000 times more in number of transactions than cross-border payments, right? But however, these, they are done with foreign payment processors and payment providers and credit card providers and so on, will end up being stored elsewhere. So where is all this data about our transactions? Do we have individual sovereignty over this data? Is there a government nationwide sovereignty over this data? These are still some questions that have to be asked, and a lot of work to do going forward.
Super. So again, to summarize, shift in digital or shift from physical to digital actually implies a lot of data that is produced, which also implies a lot of new intermediaries that have access to that data, and those intermediaries are primarily based in the global north, which brings up issues around sovereignty, both at the individual level and for nations of the global south, and of course, implications for democracy, which I would love for you to also, maybe you could get into that a little bit before we move on to Alfredo.
Sure. If you have your consumption pattern, your geolocalization, which is ingrained in the payment as well, if you have these data points that can identify you based on your where you use your card and when and how much and what stuff you're purchasing, and ever-growing list of requirements that payment processors have in terms of the detail of the transaction, where is your privacy? And if we're talking about a society that needs safe spaces for engaging in what may be in one point of history even illegal, but in another point of history not illegal, for example, the purchase of marijuana, for example, organizing in protests for civil rights of people that have been excluded and so on. These were all things that were illegal in the past, and if they had all that information in terms of the oppressive governments that would have access to that kind of information, it is very unlikely that those democratic movements would have sprawled successfully, because it's so much easier to oppress and to repress if all that information is readily available via both conventional means such as court orders, or massive access of information with backdoors and sort of big data analytics that now most governments have available. So there are serious implications in terms of democracy, organization, social movements, construction of alternative futures. If our collective capacity to organize is curtailed by basically mass surveillance through the payment systems.
So, Alfredo, to zoom in a little bit, we've got the kind of big picture of what's at stake in this transition from the cash to digital payments. Is it possible to have something like the best of both worlds, or something like, let's say, digital money without data?
Yes, definitely. So this has been a very active area of research, and cryptographers have developed protocols that actually allow you to have digital cash that offers the same properties in regards to privacy and anonymity as physical cash. So I'm actually going to describe a bit the concept of anonymous e-cash. Basically, in anonymous e-cash, what you have is that users can withdraw e-coins from a bank and then show those e-coins as a payment to a service provider, a vendor of whatever item, etc. And later on, those e-coins will be deposited again with the bank to retrieve what you have sold, to retrieve the amount of money that was being paid, right? So in a very simple design, you could imagine digital cash as based on a signature scheme, the same kind of signature scheme you'd use to sign documents. So for example, you have a document, you sign it with your secret key, and the rest of us could verify that you have signed that document with your public key, right? So we can use a signature scheme to implement anonymous e-cash. In a very simple design, what would happen is that a bank wants to issue you some money as a user, so the bank would sign this amount of money and issue it to you, right? And then in order to pay to a vendor, what you do was to send that signature to that vendor as a proof that you have that amount of money. And later on, that vendor would deposit that signature with the bank. However, if we use this very simple design, we lose our privacy. And the reason is that the bank both issued as a signature, right? We give the signature to the vendor, and then the vendor gives it to the bank. So the bank knows that this signature comes from this vendor, and therefore knows what we have done to spend that money, what we have purchased, etc. right? So we need to improve that very basic design with a few privacy properties. The first property would be to use a blind signature scheme. So instead of just the bank signing an amount of money and then giving us the signature, what we would do was use a blind signature protocol so that the bank doesn't know the signature that was issued to us. There are cryptographic ways of doing this. And later on, when we pay our vendor, instead of just sending the signature, we actually do a process that we could refer to as randomization. So we can randomize our signature before giving it to the vendor. And then when the vendor deposits the signature with the bank cannot recognize it because, first of all, he didn't know the signature, and later on, we have randomized the signature, so the vendor doesn't know the signature where it comes from either, right? So this way we can protect the privacy of the user. Then, as digital money, we have the problem also that it is very easy to copy. It's not like physical cash where there are several measures that prevent counterfeiting, right? So digital money is very easy to copy, and we also need a mechanism that prevents a malicious user from sending the same signature, randomizing it and sending it to different vendors and paying for several items, right? So in order to solve that problem, we need a mechanism for double spending detection. What we do basically is to sign, along with the amount of money, a unique serial number. For each signature, there is a unique serial number that is signed. Then, once the user has the signature, he will again randomize and show the signature and reveal this serial number to the vendor so that the vendor can check with the bank whether this serial number has already been spent or not. And if it hasn't been spent, then the vendor is able to deposit it. If it has been spent, then there is a double spending detection going on and the payment is not accepted. Now, as we can see now, this description only allows us for online payments because what we have is that the vendor needs to online, during the payment, check with the bank that the coin hasn't been spent. Now, it's very convenient to have also offline payments because in many situations, for example, vending machines or shops that are not connected to a network, they cannot actively check with the bank that a coin has already been spent. So in order to enable offline payments, what we do is to enable double spending identification. So instead of having the bank actively check whether there has been a double spending detection by checking the serial number of the signature before the vendor can accept the payment, what we do is to provide an algorithm that allows the bank to compare this payment with all previous payments, and if there was only double spending, then the bank can retrieve the identity or the public key of the user who produced that double spending. But that is only done, that can only be done, this de-anonymization can only be achieved if there is a double spending. Otherwise, the privacy of the user is protected. So in NIM, we have been developing offline anonymous e-cash schemes that actually can protect the privacy of the user and still enable offline payments. Another issue we have in the case of offline payments is that you need to be able to pay the exact amount. And the reason is that the vendor that receives, it is not possible to give change because the vendor that receives a payment and deposits it with the bank is not anonymous towards the bank because the bank needs to deposit that payment with the account of the vendor. So if the user doesn't have the exact amount of money to pay the bank, to pay the vendor, then he wouldn't be able to receive change. So for this reason, to solve this paying the exact amount problem, normally we resort to having coins of the smallest possible denomination and pay as many coins as necessary. And all our research focuses on reducing the improving the efficiency of the payment process so that paying a coin is very efficient, and then you don't have you have very efficient payments while still allowing offline payments. So what, in conclusion, I can say is that currently it is possible to have digital cash that mirrors the privacy properties in terms of anonymity that physical cash gives us.
Thank you so much. So we do have the cryptographic tools for something like eCash. And it's something that I think, like, if we can get into the CBDC talk a little bit more to the final part of the panel, when the debates around CBDCs are quite kind of contentious, so a lot of people freak out exactly about the privacy question when it comes to CBDCs, because when it comes to privacy, you know, the idea that a state holds, you know, all transaction data and can surveil everybody and can, you know, I don't know, shut down the transactions of dissidents or this, that, and whatever is quite a scary thought for a lot of people. You know, the kind of authoritarian implications is quite a scary thought. But I think we should maybe look into a little bit the digital euro as it's actually designed in terms of the technical requirements that actually were published a little bit earlier this year. I know that you've looked into that a little bit, Alfredo, if you have a few comments on that, and then maybe we can hear from Andres and Brett to wrap up.
Yeah, so I invite everybody here. I don't know if you are aware of this proposal that has been released in January this year for a digital euro. I invite everybody to read that document and share their thoughts on it and with the European body that is developing it. So it's very interesting in the sense that some parts of the document are quite detailed in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be developed or the components that the digital euro should have, while other parts regarding how things should be done or what exactly should each component do to achieve the goals that are in the document are not described really. So, I mean, this is a market research proposal, and it still needs work in order to actually develop a good proposal that is concrete for the design of the digital euro. What I can say is that the document cares about privacy in the sense that there is a ledger on top that would be managed by the European Central Bank, and this ledger is not able to find out how you spend your money. But this is done by, in the middle, having intermediaries between users and that ledger managed by the European Central Bank. And those intermediaries, which actually have the tasks of onboarding users and providing them with the software, the wallets, etc., that is needed, those intermediaries actually can learn information, and they are also responsible of enforcing several laws like anti-money laundering, etc. So it's not that the proposal totally aims at protecting privacy of the users as a whole against everybody. There are these intermediaries that can learn some information. However, in terms of the functional requirements that are given in the proposal, they mirror quite a lot what one would expect an anonymous eCash scheme like the one I have just described gives us. So actually, I think anonymous eCash would be a very good scheme to implement the digital euro.
Yeah, and I think I was looking at some numbers earlier, and it does look like about half of the central banks that are looking at CBDCs at the moment are quite keen on something like an offline eCash type design. Andres, do you want to talk a little bit about, if we go back to some of the early thinking around CBDCs, like what were they actually for? What is their original intention? And maybe also some thoughts on anonymous eCash from your perspective.
Right, so I'll start with the second point, and so as to remember that this is not hypothetical. In Canada, barely 2 years ago, we had the government of Canada decree an emergency to literally shut down the accounts and the crowdfunding of the truckers movement that was opposing vaccines. They, at that moment, claimed that it was, Russian money or whatever, and then in the eventual audit that the Canadian Parliament did, there was nothing of the sort. But they already made the scandal and justified the measure when it was fairly sort of organic. And it really makes you think whether, I don't like that you're protesting, so I shut you down from the financial system is not hypothetical. It happened 2 years ago, not in some authoritarian country of the global south, but in Canada, a privacy-preserving and human rights respecting a powerful country. So you really have to think about, okay, so how should we act now if we want to crowdfund something, crowdfund a protest? Because, crypto is not a full alternative either, because now you have the stuff on the chain and it can be easily monitored, and that's what the Canadian government did as well. So we really need to build infrastructure and technology itself so that it's resilient, privacy preserving, human rights respecting, and democracy building. Protests are part of democracy. And in terms of the design of the original CBDCs, the first CBDCs were actually thought of in the global south, not in the north. Because in the north, there are very few people that don't have bank accounts, and they have been sort of intertwined with the banking system. But in the global south, it was actually from a financial inclusion perspective, right? So you have many, many people and many, many transactions that are not done via the electronic payment systems, but actually on a bilateral physical basis. And of course, as Google and Boston Consulting Group called it in the case of India, it was a 600 billion pot of gold that was left untapped, because all that could be, extracted in terms of not just information, but liquidity that could be multiplied through the banking system. So the central banks of developing countries in the global south started to think about, okay, if we want to do a quick financial inclusion from a monetary perspective, not necessarily a business perspective, maybe what we need is, central banks to, get on this and try to do something like this. And we've had several initiatives in Africa, in South America. In the case of my country, Ecuador, we were the first modern age CBDC that experimented with this. And of course, our first CBDC was not privacy preserving. We had a ledger at the Central Bank of Ecuador with no intermediaries in the process. And in theory, the central bank could see the entire movement of money that would happen in the ledger. But you had total inclusion, because all you had to do was have a national ID number and you automatically had an account at the central bank. Now, why that I still think was important. The fact that there were no intermediaries in the middle gave the people the opportunity to make the central bank accountable to society. And that's why I still think that CBDCs are a good idea, not in a tiered version, not in a version where the private players take over the functioning of the system, but in a system where the people can have a direct relationship with the central bank. Because then they start to question the logic of money. They'll try to understand, what is this information all about? Where is all this data going? Where is all this information flowing? Oh, okay, so it's in a ledger at the central bank. Okay, then let's make it privacy enhanced. Let's put zero knowledge technology in there, zero knowledge proof technology in there, and so on. And it will create a conversation between an institution that usually in every country in the world, but especially in Europe, the central bank is out of touch with the common folks. So I think it will build an opportunity for the democratization of money, including the component of the human right to privacy.
Fantastic. Brett, last comments. Do you want to give a kind of overview? Because I'm actually very keen for the digital euro to become part of the conversation at CPDP. I think it's like quite an important conversation. We're talking about core infrastructure of society that's like really, the digitization process is sped up massively and it has huge implications. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of I've heard you speak before about how the conversation around CBDCs has kind of evolved from the early days until now and where we're at right now.
Sure. Well, maybe this follows on from Andres's points, because there's different political visions that you can kind of project into CBDC. In my first question, I mentioned this, the layers of money in our society. We essentially have 3 layers, I would say, right? So you can choose to use physical cash issued by governments, or in the case of the euro, like a kind of meta government. You can choose to use digital casino chips issued by the banking sector, all right, like Commerce Bank, for example. Or you could use digital casino chips, or like third layer casino chips issued by players like PayPal, all right, or like stable coins. Those are a third layer thing built on top of the banking sector, which is built on top of the central banking layer. Now, one of the big politics about layer 2, the commercial bank layer, is that the commercial banks have the ability to issue out far more of these second layer digital casino chips than they have in reserves, all right? So they create money through the process of issuing loans, all right? Now, and so a large part of the money supply actually takes the form of commercial bank issued digital casino chips. Now, historically, monetary reform movements who are concerned about the power of the banking sector were concerned by that, right? Because basically what the banking sector has the power to mobilize or shut down particular industries in society. So the banking sector's choices about which industries to support gives them huge amounts of political power. And if you're a monetary reform movement and you want to reduce the power of the banking sector, that's a power you might want to take away from them. All right? But politically, that's largely impossible in many capitalist countries because the banking sector often has huge political power. So monetary reform groups, for example, in the UK back in 2015, started thinking about, could we use a form of so-called digital cash to weaken the banking sector? This would be another way of saying, could we give ordinary citizens access to the central bank? All right? Because right now, only the commercial banks have access to the central bank, where they use what's called reserves, which is a digital form of state-issued money. But imagine if we gave everybody access to the central bank, it would cut into the realm of the commercial banking sector. So the original version of CBDCs, or the original proposals, at least in the Western world, and I'm taking into account, of course, that this is a kind of European-focused position I'm giving here, was partially about, can we weaken the banking sector? All right. Now, bear in mind, most central banks don't want to weaken the banking sector because they're often acting to try and protect financial stability and protect the banking sector often. So the version of CBDC that we're looking at right now actually started to come out during the pandemic when the central banks twigged that there was a massive financial stability problem if that layer 1 physical cash was undermined, right? You'd have huge problems of public confidence in the banking sector, which is why one of the big things I always talk about right now is I think the digital euro strapline is like an anchor for the digital age, all right? Any central banker knows this about the anchoring role of central bank money. It anchors the commercial bank money, right? So they're now thinking about, okay, can we make this anchor? But the problem that they're stuck in now is that if they do that, they kind of go into that zone of the monetary reformers, which is like, well, actually, we'll start to potentially compete with the banking sector through this digital form of money. Historically, this didn't occur because physical cash didn't really compete with bank-issued digital money. All right. So what they're going to be doing right now in all the discussions, the banking sector is lobbying the hell out of the ECB and all the central banks to try and weaken the CBDC proposals, to kind of water them down, to make them friendly to the banking sector, which is why they're going to be having all these intermediaries, for example, coming into the process to essentially scrape data and fees and so on and try to minimize the impact of the CBDC on the central banks. Maybe the last thing I'll say about this is that in the sort of popular discourse right now, this is all intersecting with the rise of the populist right, which is a whole kind of much bigger topic. And many people in the populist right have become sort of very agitated by this intersection between the two kind of core pillars of many sort of mainstream conversations right now, which is the so-called digital transition and the green transition, all right? So the digital transition basically emerges from bog standard capitalist processes where corporations want to automate everything, all right? So digitization is all about automation. It's about how do you speed up, accelerate the processes of an economic system. The green transition, by contrast, is how you slow things down. And that comes from a totally different source. It comes from decades of lobbying by climate change campaigners, right? And now we find in mainstream institutions these two agendas, which often don't work together, sort of put together. All right, and what's been happening on the populist right is they're starting to basically make out that, for example, the CBDC will be used to force you to buy, you know, the proverbial vegan sausages, or force you to declare your carbon footprint and so on. So there's a whole kind of public narrative emerging about CBDC being an instrument of kind of woke authoritarian control. Now, this is not really necessarily found in mainstream circles, but it's definitely in my world, when I'm doing cash protection, I'm finding a lot of people who are starting to buy into that populist right version of the anti-cashless society argument. So it's definitely something to be aware of in the political space right now.
Great, thanks very much. I think we're just up against time. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I think to try and kind of synthesize for a second, I hope that gave a little bit of an impression of like what's actually at stake in this big change from physical modes of payment to digital modes of payment, and what that means in terms of data and who has control over the data, and the implications for privacy. Just to kind of note that, you know, when we're talking about payments, we're talking about our everyday lives, right? We're talking about kind of leaving behind data traces of things that are, you know, everything from our kind of spending habits to our state of mind to our lifestyle. It reveals a lot about a person and about an organization or so on. So there's quite a lot at stake in these transitions and in these debates, and I hope we've brought that to the table in a way that resonates and is meaningful. Should I hand over to? Do we have time for one or two questions, or should we just move? One question? Any burning questions in the audience? Otherwise, I'll pass the mic over. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.